Before the world was engulfed in flames, the first sparks ignited in the east. A rising empire made a choice, and the world would never be the same. To truly understand World War II, you must begin where the storm really started. Asia. Before the first shots were fired in Europe, before the world spoke the names Hitler or Normandy, a different fuse had already been lit, thousands of miles away. It began with a nation determined to redefine its destiny, a nation convinced that the old world had left it no choice but to carve out a new one. This is the story of how Japan's march across Asia set the stage for a conflict that would soon consume the entire globe. When we look back at the early decades of the 20th century, we see a nation at a crossroads, pulled between its ancient traditions and the rushing force of a modern world. Japan was once an isolated kingdom, content with its own rhythms in the Far East. But as the world changed, so too did Japan, and not slowly, but with a speed that startled even the great powers of the age. The transformation began with a realization. Isolation meant vulnerability. While Western empires expanded across oceans, carving up Asia and reshaping global trade, Japan watched and understood a hard truth. Remain still and be swallowed. So the nation opened its gates, studied the world beyond its shores, and absorbed everything it could with an intensity almost unheard of. Factories rose where farmland once lay. Steamships filled harbors that had been silent for centuries. A new generation grew up believing that destiny was no longer something inherited, but something built. And as industry surged, so did ambition. There was a growing belief, whispered first in private rooms and later spoken openly in public squares, that Japan had been chosen by fate to lead the East into a new era. Modern armies marched with precision. Warships gleamed in the sun. The nation was no longer content to watch history unfold. It was preparing to shape it. But transformation comes with hunger. A hunger for resources, for recognition, for a place among the world's giants. Japan looked inward and saw strength, but looked outward and saw a map dominated by the West. Much of Asia had already been seized by European empire. The land was rich, the markets vast, the resources abundant, yet Japan held none of them. A question began to echo across the highest circles of power. If others can build empires, why not us? The victories in the Sino-Japanese War and later against Russia only fueled that fire. Japan defeated a European empire, something no Asian nation had done in modern times. The world took notice. For some, it was admiration. For others, unease. But within Japan, the meaning was clear. This was proof of destiny. Proof that the rise was a path that must be followed. Military officers, scholars, industrial leaders all began speaking of expansion not as a choice, but as survival. Factories needed coal. Warships needed steel. Cities needed oil. And these things were found outside Japan's borders, in lands that seemed both near and vulnerable. The idea of building a greater East Asia grew not in the shadows but in the open, carried by newspapers, textbooks, and patriotic songs. Children were taught that Japan's strength was Asia's strength, and that its expansion was a mission of liberation, not conquest. But beneath the patriotic words lay a colder truth. The rise of this new empire would not come peacefully. Japan was becoming something the world had not expected, a nation ready to challenge the global order, armed with ambition, industry, and a belief that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. This rising empire, however, faced a problem. Japan had modernized far faster than its natural resources could support. Oil, rubber, iron, the very lifeblood of industry, were scarce. Power demanded more than just ambition. It demanded control. And in the eyes of Japan's leaders, the lands of Asia offered both opportunity and justification. They saw expansion as the only path forward. A nation must grow, or it will wither. That was the creed When Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, the world watched with an uneasy silence. It was the opening move in a much larger strategy, one that would redraw the map of Asia. China soon became the next target, and what followed was a conflict of unimaginable brutality. Cities fell. Millions suffered. But Japan pushed forward, believing it was building a new order for the East. Yet Japan's expansion wasn't just reshaping Asia, it was colliding with global interests. Western powers, especially the United States and Britain, saw their influence threatened. Trade restrictions tightened. Oil embargoes arrived. Diplomacy strained to the breaking point. What began as a regional struggle now touched the nerves of nations far beyond Asia. Japan stood at a crossroads. Yield to pressure or strike before being strangled by it. In 1941, they chose the latter. With one devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan's expansion once, a regional ambition ignited a truly global conflict. A war that had simmered in Asia for a decade now, detonated across continents and oceans. But the deeper question remains. Why did the world fail to see the real beginning? Why did the early warnings from Asia go unanswered until it was too late? Because history often waits for Europe to move before the world pays attention. Yet the road to World War II was paved long before tanks rolled into Poland. It began with a rising empire in the East, reshaping the destiny of nations one conquest at a time. And to understand the global war that followed, we must return to where the flame was first struck in the heart of Asia, under the rising sun. When we look back at the early decades of the 20th century, we see a nation standing at a crossroads, pulled between its ancient traditions and the rushing force of a modern world. Japan was once an isolated kingdom, content with its own rhythms and its own quiet place in the Far East. But as the world changed, so too did Japan, and not slowly, not cautiously, but with a speed that startled even the great powers of the age. The transformation began with a single, powerful realization. Isolation meant vulnerability. While Western empires expanded across oceans, carving up Asia and reshaping global trade, Japan watched from a distance and understood a hard truth: remain still and be swallowed. And so the nation threw open its gates, studied the world beyond its shores, and absorbed everything it could with an intensity almost unheard of. Factories rose where farmland once lay. Steamships filled harbors that had been silent for centuries. A new generation grew up believing that destiny was no longer something inherited, but something built. And as industry surged, so did ambition. There was a growing belief, whispered first in private rooms and later spoken openly in public squares, that Japan had been chosen not by geography or chance, but by fate, to lead the East into a new era. Modern armies marched with precision. Warships gleamed in the sun. The nation was no longer content to watch history unfold. It was preparing to shape it. But this kind of transformation comes with a hunger for resources, for recognition, for a place among the world's giants. Japan looked inward and saw strength, but looked outward and saw a map dominated by the West. Much of Asia had already been seized by European empires. The land was rich, the markets vast, the resources abundant, yet Japan held none of them. And so a question began to echo across the highest circles of power. If others can build empires, why not us? The victories in the Sino-Japanese War and later against Russia only fueled that fire. Japan defeated a European empire, something no Asian nation had done in modern times. The world took notice. For some nations, it was admiration. For others, unease. But within Japan, the meaning was clear. This was proof of destiny. Proof that the rise was not an illusion, but a path that must be followed. Military officers, scholars, and industrial leaders all began speaking of expansion. Not as a choice, but as survival. Factories needed coal. Warships needed steel. Cities needed oil. And these things were found outside Japan's borders, in lands that seemed both near and vulnerable. The idea of building a greater East Asia grew not in the shadows but in the open, carried by newspapers, textbooks, and patriotic songs. Children were taught that Japan's strength was Asia's strength, and that its expansion was a mission of liberation, not conquest. But beneath the patriotic words lay a colder truth. The rise of this new empire would not come peacefully. Japan was becoming something the world had not expected. A nation ready to challenge the global order, armed with ambition, industry, and a belief that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. The confidence that surged through the nation carried it forward, and soon its ambitions stretched far beyond its own shores. What began as an internal transformation evolved into an outward reach, a search for space, influence, and identity across the vast landscapes of Asia. And as Japan stepped beyond its borders, the balance of an entire region began to shift in ways the world had not anticipated. At the time, Asia was a continent living under foreign shadows. European empires dominated its trade, its ports, even its political destinies. Britain controlled vast territories stretching from India to the Malay Peninsula. France held India. The Dutch possessed the resource-rich East Indies. And in the very heart of the continent, China, once a mighty civilization, was weakened by internal turmoil and the heavy hand of foreign powers. To Japan, this patchwork of influence looked less like stability and more like an open invitation. When Japan moved into Manchuria, it claimed to be protecting its interests, maintaining order, and securing vital resources. But the truth was far more transformative. That single move disrupted decades of influence carefully maintained by Western powers. Railway lines, mines, and farmlands that had been part of international networks were suddenly under Japanese control. It was a shift that sent tremors through diplomatic circles from London to Washington, and the tremors grew louder when Japan pushed deeper into China. Cities that had once been bustling centers of trade under the watchful eye of foreign concessions were now caught in waves of military advance and resistance. Each step Japan took forced other nations to reassess their roles, their interests, and their future in Asia. The region, once a series of isolated struggles, became increasingly interconnected by a rising tension. In the bustling streets of Shanghai, foreign communities watched events unfold with anxiety. Businesses linked to British banks, American oil, and French manufacturing depended on a stable China. Japan's march threatened not just political control, but the economic arteries of global trade. Ships that sailed between Asia and the West carried more than cargo. They carried the weight of international profit, influence, and pride. And now, all of it was at risk. But the impact of Japan's expansion was not felt only by foreign powers. Across Asia, people who had lived under colonial rule for generations saw something else. An Asian nation standing up to the West, refusing to bow, refusing to be carved up or controlled. Some admired this. Others feared it. Yet for everyone, the certainty was the same. The old order was cracking. Local leaders, merchants, and intellectuals debated the meaning of Japan's rise. Was it a sign that Asia was awakening, or was it simply one empire replacing another? Japan's actions forced these questions into homes, classrooms, and marketplaces. The region was no longer a passive landscape. It had become the center of a growing storm. As Japan established puppet governments, built railways, and expanded industries in the territories it seized, the political landscape of Asia became unrecognizable. Borders meant less. Alliances shifted. Independence movements watched closely, wondering whether this upheaval could become an opportunity or a catastrophe. Meanwhile, European powers, already stretched thin by economic depression and rising tensions in Europe, found their attention divided. They could no longer maintain the dominance they once held with ease. Japan filled the vacuum with astonishing speed, presenting itself as both liberator and conqueror, depending on who was looking. And as each new region fell under Japanese influence, a deeper reality surfaced. Control over Asia was slipping from Western hands. The region's fate was no longer determined in distant capitals, but on the ground, in the battles, negotiations, and political recalibrations. Forced by Japan's advance, with every border crossed, the balance of Asia tilted further. What had once been a quiet contest of influence became a direct challenge to the global hierarchy. The world was watching a transformation unfold, one that would not remain confined to the East for long, because the shifting balance in Asia was reaching a point from which there could be no peaceful return. As tension thickened across the continent, the consequences of Japan's rise grew impossible to contain. What had started as an internal transformation, then evolved into sweeping expansion across Asia, was now pressing into the interests of powers far beyond the region. The careful balance that once kept Asia divided under multiple spheres of influence had fractured, and in the widening cracks, global forces began to converge. Western nations watched each new Japanese advance with a mixture of alarm and uncertainty. Their diplomats sent warnings, their newspapers printed anxious headlines, their economic advisors calculated losses as valuable territories, trade routes, and investments slipped into Japanese control. But behind every calculation lay a deeper fear. If Japan continued unchecked, the entire structure of global power might tilt away from the West. In Washington, London, and other capitals, officials debated how to respond. They saw Japan not merely as a rising Asian state, but as a challenger to a global system built over centuries. A system that relied on access to Asian markets, resources, ports, and influence. Japan's expansion was not a distant event. It was a direct threat to their own economic lifelines. The United States felt the pressure tightening. American industries depended heavily on Pacific trade, and American oil companies were, ironically, supplying Japan's growing military machine. American territories, from the Philippines to Guam, suddenly felt the tremors of conflict shaking Asia. At the same time, the U.S. had long positioned itself as a defender of China's territorial integrity, believing China's vast markets were essential for future global trade. Japan's deepening presence in China wasn't just an intrusion. It was a direct challenge to America's vision of the Pacific. Britain faced its own dilemma. Its empire stretched across Asia, from India to the rich harbors of Hong Kong and Singapore. But Britain was overstretched, burdened by economic strain and the rising threat of war in Europe. As Japan advanced, British officials knew they couldn't afford a direct confrontation. Yet, they also knew that each step Japan took weakened Britain's grip on its own empire. The more Japan expanded, the more Britain's image of invincibility eroded in the eyes of its colonial subjects. Japan understood this power vacuum, and it moved quickly. But the faster Japan moved, the more hostile the world became. Economic sanctions tightened. The United States restricted exports of aviation fuel, machine parts, and eventually oil, the very lifeline of Japan's industry and military. Britain and the Netherlands followed suit. Japan, a nation whose engines had outrun its natural resources, now faced the terrifying prospect of paralysis. Without oil, its warships couldn't sail, its planes couldn't fly, its factories would grind to a halt, its empire would collapse before it truly matured. Pressure built like steam in a sealed chamber. Japanese leaders saw the embargoes not as diplomacy, but as strangulation. They believed they were being forced into submission by nations that claimed the moral high ground while maintaining vast empires of their own. They felt boxed in, cornered, their ambitions choked by a system designed to keep Asia divided and the West dominant. And in that atmosphere of rising desperation, a terrible logic took hold. Strike first, strike hard, and break the ring of encirclement before it tightened beyond escape. In Southeast Asia, Japan saw abundant resources. Oil in the Dutch East Indies, Robert in Malaya, tin in Thailand, and strategic ports across the region. Capturing these territories would ensure survival, but doing so would place Japan on a direct collision course with Western powers. There would be no turning back. War in Asia had already been raging for years, but now the boundaries of that conflict were stretching outward. Diplomats made final attempts to negotiate, but trust had long since eroded. Meetings became accusations. Requests became ultimatums. Every hour brought the world closer to a confrontation none claimed to want. Yet all were preparing for it. And then came the moment when the tension finally snapped. Days before Japanese fleets moved into position, observers across the Pacific noticed subtle signs: troop buildups, naval mobilizations, and coded communications flowing with unusual intensity. Some suspected an attack but didn't know where or when. Others believed Japan would never dare challenge a power as vast as the United States. But history often turns on the moments when leaders gamble everything on a single, decisive strike. When Japanese aircraft lifted into the sky over the Pacific and sped toward their targets, the conflict that had simmered in Asia for a decade finally burst onto the global stage. The attack shocked the world, but in truth, it had been building for years, forged in resource shortages, diplomatic failures, clashing ambitions, and a world order that could no longer contain the forces rising against it. The battles that followed stretched across oceans and continents, from the jungles of Burma to the deserts of North Africa, from the islands of the Pacific to the cities of Europe. But at the heart of this global conflict lay the collision born in Asia, collision between a rising empire determined to reshape the world and the established powers desperate to preserve it. The fire that consumed the globe hadn't begun with a single explosion. It had started much earlier, in the slow and relentless march of a nation seeking space, security, and destiny across a continent already claimed by others. And once that march crossed the interests of the world's strongest powers, the path to a global war became not just likely, but inevitable. In the end, the world didn't stumble into global war by accident. It marched toward it step by step, pushed forward by ambition, fear, and the failure to understand the warning signs rising from the east. Asia had been the first stage where the old order cracked, where an emerging power collided with the empires that had long dominated the world. And once those cracks spread outward, they reached every ocean, every capital, every border drawn on a map. Japan's transformation had begun as a quest for security, a struggle to stand equal with nations that had once dismissed it. But in chasing that equality, Japan reshaped far more than its own destiny. It altered the fate of colonies, challenged the authority of Western empires, and awakened a region long suppressed under foreign rule. Yet the same expansion that brought its strength also set off alarms that echoed across the planet. The nations watching from afar could not ignore the shifting tides. Their embargoes, their warnings, and their military preparations created a chain of reactions that tightened the pressure on all sides. Diplomacy became a battlefield of its own, a place where every promise felt like a threat and every offer felt like a trap. And when diplomacy finally collapsed, the world was left standing on the edge of a war that could no longer be avoided. The flames that erupted afterward consumed millions of lives and forever reshaped nations. But understanding where those flames were first lit offers more than just historical clarity. It reminds us that global conflict rarely begins with a single moment or a single decision. It begins quietly, in shifts of power, in ambitions left unchecked, in regions where the world is not looking closely enough. And for that reason, the story of Japan's expansion in Asia is not just a chapter of the past. It is a warning carved into history, a reminder that when rising powers challenge an established world, the consequences rarely stay confined to one corner of the map. Thank you for watching. If you found this historical deep dive interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explain how our world came to be. We'll see you in the next one.